Hans Morgenthau was one of my favorite writers from grad school. I first got into political science by way of international relations. I was very interested in being a journalist, and I wanted to know more about politics and particularly international relations. And somewhere along the way, there was enough theory in international relations for me to get it. Basically, I fell in love with theory, and so I ended up veering off into political philosophy. And Hans Morgenthau's thought was one of those that pushed me in that direction, because even though Morgenthau was a professor of political science and his specialty was international relations, he was first and foremost a theorist, and I would say a political philosopher. And so, the classics of international relations come from what's more or less the realm of political philosophy. And it drew me away because these were the kind of big questions that I wanted to ask. So even though Hans Morgenthau is writing in this piece mainly for the sake of international relations and to set people straight about some misconceptions he thinks they have, nevertheless, his points are larger than that, and they apply across the spectrum of the scientific approach to political and social problems. His most famous work is a textbook called Politics Among Nations, which was originally published in 1948 but continued to be used for a long, long time, and even now is referenced by anybody who is writing in the field of IR theory. We are reading a selection from a book called Scientific Man versus Power Politics. It was published in 1946, so it was a couple of years earlier than Politics Among Nations, and I think in that way is a little bit more of a taste of Morgenthau's original thought. It's also a much smaller book. It's more compact. It spends a lot less time on historical examples, but it exemplifies Morgenthau's school of thought that he basically created of modern international relations realism. Among other things, Morgenthau is famous for being an advocate of the balance of power strategy in foreign policy, which basically assumes that all countries are going to have to continue for all time to face other countries which might oppose them and try to interfere with their interests, and that the best that they can do is to ward off that danger by being strong in a measured sense to deter other countries from basically becoming bold enough to do that. Balance of power strategy hopefully would keep the peace, and you can see in that the basic insight Morgenthau wants to get across, even in this chapter, which is that nothing is ever perfect and nothing can be perfectible, and the best that people can do is to try to push back against the chaos of life and try to make incremental positive changes. But when we get caught up in the idea that there's some absolute solution, then we tend to make more trouble for ourselves. So the underlying question of this work actually is, why hasn't knowledge, and in particular scientific knowledge, saved us? We have had an ever-increasing amount of scientific knowledge, both in the social sciences and in the natural sciences, and yet in some ways the world is a more precarious place despite it. So Morgenthau pushes back against that faith in scientific knowledge by pointing out that wars have become more, not less, violent and more apocalyptic, not less. He says the revival of religious wars in the form of warfare between political ideologies, with the concomitant torture, punishment, and extermination of dissenters, illuminates the degree to which that change has taken place in our time. As Sumner put it almost 40 years ago, the amount of superstition is not much changed, but it now attaches to politics, not to religion. So there you see again the characteristic thinking of Morgenthau. It may seem like progress that we've exited to a certain extent, although he was a little bit optimistic in that regard, but exited to a certain extent, war based upon religious differences. But if we look at the current situation, and he was, this book was published right after World War II, what he saw was we got rid of one type of religious war in favor of another type of religious warfare that was even more dangerous, more totalitarian, more total than the previous one in the form of ideological warfare. In World War II, of course, the fight between liberal democracies and Nazism and fascism. And in the very near future, it would be the Cold War between liberal democracy and capitalism and Soviet communism. Morgenthau was very suspicious of ideological thinking. He thought that it made people do things that were contrary to their true self-interest, and that they needed to keep their eye on much more concrete things like their national security and what it was that they could do to shore that up. But that they often forgot about that if they became true believers in a particular system that they wished to promote, whether it was democracy or communism. So in this chapter, he's critiquing the type of rationalism that comes out of the Enlightenment, and in his view comes to fruition in the vision of Woodrow Wilson, for instance, in the aftermath of the First World War, to establish a League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, but was born of this idea that we can that would be the last war, the war to end all wars. And we can create universal peace if we just come up with a structure that every nation can agree to abide by. Morgenthau says rationalism misunderstands the nature of man, the nature of the world, and the nature of reason itself. So he makes a distinction between rationalism and reason. And he's not arguing that human beings shouldn't employ reason, but rationalism is a different beast, and it involves a sort of faith or belief in the absolute supremacy of human reason that's characterized first with the flourishing of European Enlightenment thought of the 17th and 18th century. He says, it sees reason as an independent and self-sufficient force which cannot fail, sooner or later, to eliminate the still remaining vestiges of unreason. And it sees evil as simply a lack of reason or a lack of information or education, so that the wiping out of evil in the world can take place through increased knowledge and education. He juxtaposes Enlightenment liberalism with Augustinian realism. Of course, St. Augustine is who he's referencing there, author of The City of God, a figure from the 4th century A.D., who, when he converted to Christianity, decided that human nature was basically marked forever by eternal or original sin, and could only be saved by the grace of God, which is still a very typical Christian position today. He thought, therefore, that whatever human beings made in this world was necessarily going to be flawed. It didn't mean that it had to be totally evil, but it was always going to be mixed with that sin, because that was embedded within human nature. And while human beings lived on earth, while some may be better than others, they still lived in the condition tainted with original sin and influenced by all the people in the world, many of whom, at least part of the time, are embedded in sin, doing the wrong thing. So he is the father of a certain type of realism. The old-fashioned Augustinian realism does acknowledge this spiritual aspect of evil. And even though Morgenthau might not totally embrace the whole religious vision here, he likes the idea of sin and evil, because these things are ineradicable by human efforts. They take some higher power. And as Augustine argued in the City of God, the City of God exists only in its perfection, only in heaven. It can touch the earth. It can influence the ways of men. It can, it can influence better institutions and better laws, but it can never perfect them. It lies outside of this world. It's in the realm of heaven and of God. So from this perspective, Augustine thought that it was best to have a fairly strong government, good laws with teeth enforced by a strong government, because it could then keep the order, because inevitably in this world there's going to be disorder, and we need something to push back against that. And it would be a continual struggle against both disorder and also corruption. Morgenthau writes, "The awareness of unresolvable discord, contradictions, and conflicts which are inherent in the nature of things and which human reason is powerless to solve, the age of science has completely lost this awareness." In other words, he calls it the scientist philosophy at one point, which I think is a term that's also used by Jacques Ellul, who we're reading for this week. But he thinks that the scientist philosophy is unwilling to admit there are problems that are unresolvable in the absolute sense. It doesn't mean that you can't use a variety of means to push back and mold and try to make things better, but it does mean that human beings simply cannot fully resolve certain problems and will continue in a Promethean type of fashion to fight back up against them in an uphill battle, you might say, the entire way. He then backs up his conclusions about human nature and the human predicament by these three elemental human experiences. He says, first, human beings experience the unceasing struggle between good and evil, life and death, health and sickness, peace and war. In other words, this is the human condition in our lived lives that we perceive. We know that there is this unceasing struggle between good and evil, life and death, health and sickness, peace and war, and that has always been the case. Second, he says, human beings experience the transformation of their good intentions into evil results. So, and this is something, he says we all experience this, that we set out and we make a plan, whether as individuals or in a corporate manner at the level of some government. We make these plans to fix a problem, to improve our lives, but then unintended things happen. There are unintended consequences that get in the way of achieving what we intend, and sometimes backfire quite drastically. And then third, he says human beings experience an inability to grasp the whole answer. They only have bits and pieces answered, and they slip away. This again is a universal and timeless human experience of thinking that you've just about got it, or thinking that you have created a system that encompasses everything and will provide the ultimate solution. Okay, I'm just as guilty of this as anybody else, right? Only to find that it does not. Only to find that something lies outside of that answer and that you do not have it. You, in fact, have a picture of what's going on perhaps right at the moment, or at least one slice of that, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, for people to see from God's point of view, to use his imagery. So here we have Woodrow Wilson, who was actually a political scientist. I think the only president to be a political scientist whose 14 points were guidance for how things should go after the war, including the formation of the League of Nations, which was his brainchild. Morgenthau writes that rationalism denies the three aforementioned elemental human experiences, and it thinks it can solve what formerly were ethical and moral problems. So it is a sort of hubris or pride from Morgenthau's perspective to think that now, at this point in time, because we know more, whether this is from the Enlightenment period or more recently in the 20th century or now, it's a sort of pride to think that we have developed to the point where we can solve social, political, and environmental problems using facts and technical ability alone. He asserts that such things always involve ethical and moral reasoning, and that reasoning can't take place in the realm of rationalism. He points out that a rationalist education becomes factual, but it moves away from moral education. He says education will overcome the social stupidity which alone stands in the way of progress and reason. That's the point of view of the rationalist when it comes to education. But again, he sees that as a sort of sign of pride, as though people haven't already tried that approach for millennia and have failed. And more or less he's saying, what makes you think that at this point in time you have enough knowledge to finally do this with education? If we want to kind of bring this down to earth a little bit in a different realm, we could think about the problem of racism and the violence that ensues because of racism, and folks who have thought that if we just change the way we educate kids and taught them the facts about what makes a human being and why color doesn't matter, and that race is maybe even some sort of more social construct and so on, that we could create a different type of society. But we find out time and time again that despite being exposed to more and more information and just generally being exposed to more and more diversity, there's still problems with racism. And Morgenthau would say that that is because of moral failings on the part of people, and therefore a moral solution needs to be applied, moral and to a certain extent just political and economic and other practical solutions, and that this is a continual struggle, that we may never be able to overcome these things entirely, and to think that we will by putting all of our energy into education may actually make it harder for us to tackle the true problem and solve it to the extent that we can. So while the rationalist thinks that the way to overcome social stupidity is to teach long-term rational self-interest, realists think that man is going to act in his short-term interests and on emotions more often than not. Hence, people will always be biased. Okay? The idea that we can teach people how to think in terms of their long-term rational self-interest is pretty fundamental to the whole rationalist way of thinking. But Morgenthau is saying that people continue, especially when they're pressed by some sort of problem, economic, political, social, that they tend to revert back to more short-term thinking about their interests, something closer to selfishness than enlightened self-interest, and react on emotions, which oftentimes are fear and revulsion. And basically, we have to take that fact into account rather than continuing to more or less wish it were otherwise. He says this vicious circle of basically thinking that you just need more facts and more knowledge can be broken only by a different philosophic approach to the general problem of social action. And then he offers 3 solutions to the problem of rationalism, and all of them are at a fairly abstract level, but start to think about our own subject matter of environmental harm and the problems of the food system as we're going through this. So hopefully you can see the application. First, Morgenthau suggests that we recognize that there is a fundamental difference between problems of the social and political world and the problems recognized by the natural sciences. What he means by that, at the very least, is that you can't study human beings in a laboratory setting, nor can you break them down to the level of experiment. And human beings have this terrible, seemingly ineradicable tendency to have free will, and therefore, because in the case of our subject matter, because human beings are a major part, in fact the most important part of the problems having to do with environment and the food system, then how can we solve those problems using the natural sciences alone, right? Because human beings are in the mix, and we cannot examine their behavior nor control it in the way we can in the laboratory. Secondly, he says we need to recognize that selfishness and lust for power, or animus dominandi, are at the root of social and political problems. This is what makes people do the irrational things that they do, the seemingly irrational things which they feel are in their short term, at the very least, self-interest, or that make them feel good. If we understand that this is why we can't control and why we can't predict what they will do, in a sort of scientific sense, then we can begin to think more philosophically, and I think he uses the term wisdom at some point in this chapter, develop a certain wisdom about how to deal with this human nature to the extent that we can. Third, and not surprisingly, he says we need to recognize that these problems are eternal, but they can be mitigated. They cannot be cured, but they can be mitigated. They can be made better. I hope you're seeing a pattern here of threes. Morgenthau liked threes a great deal. So he talks next about 3 factors in mitigation. Mitigation, by the way, is my term, not his, but I think it fits pretty well. How do we mitigate, meaning we can't solve, but we can, again, push back? He talks about 3 ways, 3 factors. 1, social pressure. 2, improving conditions of life. And 3, adequate moral climate. And I'm just going to read that section down at the bottom of page 217 where he lays those out. He says, the temporary and ever precarious solution of this, as of any other social problem, depends essentially upon 3 factors. Social pressure, which is able to contain the selfish tendencies of human nature within socially tolerable bounds. Conditions of life, creating a social equilibrium which tends to minimize the psychological causes of social conflict such as insecurity, fear, and aggressiveness. And finally, a moral climate which allows man to expect at least an approximation to justice here and now, and thus offers a substitute for strife as a means to achieve justice. So the first has to do with having a fairly strong culture, I think, where people have these moral norms. And so when there are bad actors or when there are people who have motives that go against the social good, there's disapproval and there's pushback. The reference to creating improved conditions of life has to do with the idea that people are more likely to do harm if they feel desperate, if they're not well supported. I would think that would involve providing good government and social institutions to support people. And the third one has to do with the provision of justice. So the provision of justice, some approximation of justice, also has to do with good government. So you can see a theme developing here that is similar to Augustine's theme, that, without the solid foundation of a decent government, one that's predictable, reliable, and approximately just, it's difficult to avoid some of the problems that human beings can create that end up creating both civil and international warfare. And we can extrapolate from that also create other problems. When you're in an environment, in other words, where people are morally confused, where government does not provide a solid notion of justice and or doesn't enforce it adequately, then many bad actors can sort of fill the void and create problems. He ends the chapter talking about statesmanship, and again he's talking about somebody like a president or prime minister and the type of person he or she should be in order to make good decisions in the international arena. But these also can be qualities that can extend to leaders at different levels and different purposes. A statesman's knowledge, according to Morgenthau, is different from a rationalist's. The statesman, and he's drawing the idea of the statesman from the Aristotelian concept. A statesman is someone whose knowledge is drawn from experience, both his own personal experience, those of the people around him, and his knowledge of history. It's a type of knowledge that is as much felt at the gut level as it is calculated in the mind. It doesn't have so much to do with studying as experiencing. Because of this, it's a type of knowledge that can be more easily applied to a specific circumstance and takes the circumstance into account. A thorough study of history, for instance, will give you certainly an idea that certain events are similar to others that have happened before, but also the sense that every event has its unique circumstances. And so there can't be a one-size-fits-all solution. Even if something worked in an instance, in an iteration prior that was similar to what's going on now, you can't assume that that can be brought to play wholesale in this particular situation. And that is why the accumulated experience and knowledge is so important. You can get a feel for the specific circumstance and apply the solution that you think best fits. But statesmanship also means an acceptance of limitations and the element of risk. And this is something that the rationalist doesn't want to admit, that the statesman has to deal with. And Morgenthau makes a big deal over this being the most tragic element of the leader, is that a person in a leadership position, if has this kind of knowledge, well, he knows that he's taking a risk, that the decisions he makes may backfire, that even though he has the best of intentions, harm may come from it, and that he's going into the future relatively blind, despite the knowledge and experience that he has. And this creates a humility and a sense of measure, in a sense that we ought to achieve the limited good, the immediate good, the good that we can obtain at this point. And if we can accept this tragic nature of life, we are freed then to find imperfect but possible solutions. And this line of thought actually made me think of Martin Luther King. I was trying to think of who would be the best example that everybody would be familiar with of this particular way of thinking. I would say that Martin Luther King would qualify as a Morgenthauian statesman because he did understand the human nature in the way that Morgenthau describes, I think. In his rhetoric, you get a sense that he does understand human nature from this broadly Christian perspective, in which human beings are marked by this original sin and they have to struggle against it. And in his approach to fighting for civil rights, he knew that he was, for instance, putting himself in harm's way, that he might get killed, that others might get killed, even though he was proposing a nonviolent type of movement. He understood the type of responsibility he was taking on his shoulders, and he also had limited goals. He wasn't he wasn't demanding that all of white America become instantly, or even over the course of time, completely unbiased or, completely in harmony with black people, but he wanted them to come closer to their stated ideals, the ideals that they said they embraced in the U.S. Constitution, and particularly in the Bill of Rights, and also in their Christian ideals. And so Martin Luther King, I know many of the people in those days would have seen him as a sort of revolutionary figure, but in hindsight anyway, he appears to be a leader who had a pretty realistic grasp of what was possible and did not try to push far beyond that. Yes, he had a dream, but he did state it as a dream. In other words, he had this vision of what America might look like at some point in the future, a beautiful vision, which he hoped that America would evolve into. He didn't say how long it would take, and he wasn't going to wait for people to all be in this harmonious place to be able to be happy and satisfied. He was going to push for what he could obtain at that point in time and create a rung on the ladder, you might say. So to draw all this back to our class's subject matter, we're going to be looking at thinkers who believe that the way out of the environmental and food system problems that we're becoming acquainted with is technical and scientific, and that in fact we don't need to worry as much as some people do because in the past we've seen that problems are solved by technical solutions. But on the other side we have people like Morgenthau, and we'll also be reading Jacques Ellul, I'm having you read for this week, who point out that for every one of these solutions you get another set of problems. And so, they point out these deeper systemic issues, such as original sin, if you want to put it that way, or the corruptibility of human nature, and the power of technique in the case of Ellul, that show us more the magnitude of the problem in front of us, and maybe help us to see the solutions promoted by the natural scientists as ideas and information to be used, but not as the source of salvation.